A toddler's body pulled from the jaws of an alligator. His mother, stabbed over 100 times, left in a blood-drenched bathroom. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, only silence, and a father who won't say a word. Was this a moment of madness or a plan executed to perfection? The bathroom was soaked in blood. It clung to the tile grout like ink spilled on bone. The scent of iron mixed with industrial cleaner choked the air, a harsh, sterile cover that failed to mask the violence that had taken place. It wasn't just a murder. It was a ritual of rage. She lay crumpled beside the tub. The body was no longer recognizable in the traditional sense. Over 100 stab wounds, according to the medical examiner. Some deep, some shallow, some clustered in fury, others surgical, deliberate. The walls bore spray patterns, each arc a physical echo of hatred. There were signs of a struggle, but not enough. No overturned furniture, no broken glass. The violence had been concentrated, controlled, but intensely personal. The killer had time, and more chillingly, he had silence. The door had been locked. There were no signs of forced entry. Blood had trailed from a blue sedan in the parking lot all the way to the apartment door, congealing along the welcome mat. Whoever had done this wanted her found. But something, or rather someone, was missing. There was no trace of the 2-year-old boy who was supposed to be sleeping in the next room. No toys scattered around. No crib in place. No sign of a child at all. Neighbors heard nothing the night before. No screams, no banging. Only the faint sound of muffled music, followed by stillness. That stillness now had a name, Pasheun Jeffery. Her story, though tragic, was familiar to anyone studying patterns of domestic escalation. Young, determined, a single mother trying to break free from a dead-end relationship. She had built a life for her son in spite of the odds. A full-time job at a pharmacy, a new apartment, a quiet corner of St. Petersburg where she thought she could start over. But control rarely lets go without a fight. Just a few nights prior, she had hosted a birthday party, a modest gathering for the father of her child. Friends said things seemed fine, but fine is a dangerous word in cases like these. It often masks a storm brewing just beneath the surface. That storm had a name too, Thomas Mosley. He had been staying with her on and off, unemployed, with aspirations of being a rapper. No income, but plenty of ego. Online, he posted videos flashing money, brandishing weapons, living out a fantasy far removed from his reality. Offline, he depended on her. That dependency, coupled with resentment, forms a volatile mix. One that often turns deadly when the illusion of control begins to slip. On the night of the murder, there were no indications of forced intimacy or outside intrusion. Only her, the child, and him. The party ended. The guests left. The door closed. And by morning, she was dead. The child gone. That absence, Taylen's disappearance, created a new layer of urgency. A mother murdered, and a toddler unaccounted for. The blood told a story of hate. But the missing child hinted at something even more chilling. Premeditation. Amber alerts were issued. Local police combed the area. Helicopters, drones, K-9 units, all deployed in a race against time. The assumption in those first hours was survival, that perhaps somehow the child had been taken elsewhere. But the body count of a crime like this rarely stops at one. There is a pattern, often observed in filicide cases rooted in male violence. When the perpetrator feels a loss of control, whether emotional, financial, or social, he attempts to reclaim it by destroying the very people who challenge it. In this case, the mother who no longer needed him, the child who symbolized that rejection. But there was still no body, no cries heard, no witnesses, only silence and the heavy, accumulating weight of dread. That bathroom wasn't just a crime scene. It was a message. Brutality of that scale is never incidental. It speaks to obsession, to a desire to dominate even in death. 100 stab wounds aren't about murder. They're about erasure. This was not a man who snapped. This was someone who planned to leave no trace, except he left one. The boy was missing, and the clock was already ticking. Before we continue, make sure to like and subscribe. It really helps us a lot. Thank you. 3 days after the murder, the body of a child surfaced from a predator's jaws. It was just after dusk at Lake Maggiore when a local fisherman noticed something unnatural. The lake, known for its still water and its alligators, had never frightened him. But that evening, one of the creatures floated unusually close to shore. Clamped between its jaws was a small, limp shape. At first, he thought it was a doll. The truth came seconds later, as the boat lights reflected off the child's skin. It was no toy. Law enforcement arrived within minutes. They had been combing the area since the Amber Alert had gone out. The fisherman pointed. The officer raised his weapon. One shot. The reptile jerked once, then went still. From its mouth, the body of a toddler slipped silently into the lake's edge, fully intact. Taylen Mosley. The water hadn't torn him apart. The alligator hadn't killed him. According to the coroner's report, there were no visible wounds, no signs of trauma beyond the unmistakable reality of drowning. The boy had been alive when he entered the water. It's one of the cruelest truths in homicide investigation, when a child's final moments are not only solitary but consciously terrifying. He didn't die quickly. He didn't fall asleep and fail to wake up. He was thrown into darkness, surrounded by water, unable to scream, and left to sink beneath the surface, unclaimed and alone. That image never leaves the mind of a forensic examiner. Authorities now had the body. The investigation, which had begun as a domestic homicide, had evolved into something even darker. They traced the final movements of both victims using cell phone data. Pasheun's phone had left her apartment around 8:30 p.m. on the night of her murder. The signal traveled briefly, stopped near Lake Maggiore, then ended near the home of Thomas Mosley's mother. Thomas had arrived there that evening covered in blood. Deep lacerations to both arms, not defensive wounds but slip cuts, a common injury when a blade slides down and the hand follows through. Wounds not from being attacked, but from attacking too forcefully. He didn't flee. He didn't hide. He went to a hospital and asked for treatment. When questioned, he refused to speak, demanded a lawyer, said nothing of the child. Left the searchers to keep digging. Investigators searched dumpsters, canal beds, wooded areas. They brought in divers, bloodhounds, thermal drones. But the truth had been floating in plain sight, just a few blocks from the place Thomas called home. The forensic team returned to the apartment. They recovered a bottle of household cleaner tucked under the bed, its cap stained with blood. Fingerprints matched Thomas. Blood patterns indicated an attempt to wipe down surfaces, but the effort had been rushed, incomplete. The Gucci shoe print on the floor, still visible under luminol, placed him inside the crime scene. His social media had shown the same shoes just days earlier, and still he said nothing. From a criminological perspective, this behavior aligns with a profile often observed in power control offenders. They rarely confess. Silence becomes the final method of control. Even after the act, they maintain their grip by withholding closure from the victims' families. They don't run because they believe on some level they are untouchable, or because they want to witness the fallout they've created. Thomas knew what he had done. He carried his son's last breath in his silence. He knew the police would find Taylen eventually, but by then it wouldn't matter. The shock would have done its work. The community, the family, the city, they would all be forced to live with a version of the truth that had arrived too late to save anyone. Back at the lake, a crowd had gathered. Some stood still, some wept, a few prayed. None spoke above a whisper. There is a particular kind of grief reserved for crimes like this, where innocence is discarded with deliberation, and death feels not only unjust, but indecent. The lake didn't lie. It gave back what the killer hoped it would hide. And in doing so, it whispered what the bathroom wall had already screamed. This wasn't rage. It was execution. By the time investigators presented the timeline, there was no room left for misunderstanding. Every detail spoke with cruel clarity. Pasheun had been murdered between 8 and 8:30 p.m. Her phone stopped transmitting at precisely 8:32. By 9:15, Thomas Mosley was bleeding at his mother's front door. The distance between those two locations was a 20-minute drive, which meant that somewhere in that narrow gap of time, he carried his son, alive, to the edge of Lake Maggiore, and then, without pause, let him go. No struggle, no second guessing, just silence, then water. This was not an accident, not a loss of temper. The brutality of Pasheun's death already ruled out spontaneity. But the boy, 2 years old, dressed in his favorite color, orange, he hadn't been caught in the crossfire. He had been targeted, removed, disposed of, carefully, intentionally, because he was part of her, because he was a witness, because in the twisted logic of killers who see the world as extensions of themselves, the child represented defeat. In cases like this, one often wonders if the killer regrets it. If, in the quiet moments after the act, he sees what he's done and feels the weight of it. But nothing in Thomas Mosley's behavior suggested remorse. He didn't cry. He didn't panic. He walked into a hospital, asked for stitches, and when police came to question him, he requested a lawyer and refused to say a word. It wasn't evasion. It was control. Control is everything to men like him. Not power in the traditional sense, not money, not status, but the ability to decide when someone else's life ends and how the story around that death will be told. He silenced Pasheun with a blade. He silenced Taylen with water. And then he tried to silence everyone else with his refusal to speak. His social media painted the picture long before the police arrived. A man who performed masculinity through violence, who rapped about enemies and revenge and guns, as though the fantasy had already merged with the real, who treated fatherhood as a decoration, not responsibility, and who couldn't tolerate being eclipsed by the woman he once controlled. Pasheun had made progress. A stable job, her own apartment, her name on a lease, not his. That kind of independence, to someone like Thomas, is betrayal. He wasn't losing her. He had already lost her. What remained was spectacle. The number of stab wounds matters. It tells us what the killer couldn't say in words. Over 100. That isn't heat-of-the-moment violence. That is obsession manifesting through the blade. It's what criminologists classify as overkill, when the harm goes far beyond what's needed to kill and instead reflects deep psychological fixation, with punishment, with possession, with power. After his arrest, Thomas Mosley was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. His public defender entered a not guilty plea, but the proceedings were quickly interrupted by something expected, yet still chilling in its implications. In October, a court declared him mentally unfit to stand trial. 2 court-appointed psychiatrists reviewed his case and determined he was not currently capable of understanding the charges against him or assisting in his own defense. He was committed to a state hospital for psychiatric treatment. Legal incompetence, it should be noted, is not the same as legal insanity. It does not excuse a crime. It merely delays the reckoning. And still, no testimony has come from him. No confession, no explanation, just silence as he sits under medical observation waiting for the day he might be considered restored. Waiting, perhaps, for nothing at all. Some have argued he should never have been allowed to walk free. That warning signs were there. His erratic behavior, his obsession with violence, his escalating detachment from reality. But hindsight always speaks loudest when innocence lies dead. There are cases that make the headlines, and then there are cases that etch themselves into the walls of a community. This one did both, not because of the horror alone, but because of the image it left behind. A mother, butchered in her own bathroom, A child still breathing when he met the water, and a man who didn't snap. He decided, justice may come slowly, trials can take years, appeals can stretch decades. But what was done in that apartment, and what was retrieved from that lake, cannot be undone. There is no legal process that erases the image of a child in an alligator's mouth, no sentence that restores a mother's final scream. There is only memory, and the obligation to remember, quietly, clearly, without comfort, and always without forgetting who chose to make it so.